The Synchromystic presents.
It is the unvarying rule of secret societies that the real authors never show themselves. So reported 19th to 20th century British historian Nesta Helen Webster, who researched subversive movements for over 2 decades. Esoteric and occult organizations can be curious and obscure enough on their own, but when they seem to crystallize and gain momentum seemingly out of nowhere, or when they turn out to be world historic in their impact, mysteries ramify. In this video, we will sketch profiles of 10 people who are, for all intents and purposes, ciphers. Yet their influence, mediated through airs that are much better known, is nearly incalculable. There are serious doubts about the lives, and even the existence of some or perhaps most of the individuals here profiled. The video is intended for educational or entertainment purposes only, and should not be understood as the final word on any of the events or people it discusses. The aim is to provide viewers with informational background and research leads for their own investigations. Additionally, given the arcane nature of the topic, trying to find a credible way to rank our entrants proved difficult. Therefore, with only one major exception to be identified in good time, the list has been arranged in more or less chronological order. But without further ado, Gnosticism has been a major current in the Western occult tradition. We introduced the constellation of ideas and tried to distinguish it from other terms with which it is often confused in our video 10 Arcane Words. For a crash course or a refresher, see also Gnosticism Explained in 5 minutes. Those with more interest, and a little more time, may be interested to note that we also explored the erotic fixations of so-called spermo-Gnostics in top 10 sex magic cults. Because these other materials provide an adequate foundation for the relevant concepts, I won't spend much energy reinventing the wheel here. Suffice it to say that Gnosticism was a religious worldview flourishing around the 2nd century AD that focused on spiritual advancement through the acquisition of hidden knowledge. It combined Christian, Jewish, and pagan elements. Here's the relevant bit. The reputed founder of Gnosticism was the biblical figure Simon Magus. He's also called Simon the Sorcerer, since Magos is a Greco-Roman word for magician. Simon appears in the New Testament book of the Acts of the Apostles, where it says, chapter 8, verse 13, that he became a believer in Jesus Christ. Simon observed the apostles Peter and John effecting the reception of the Holy Spirit. Verse 18 explains that Simon offered them money for knowledge of the power they possessed. This episode was the seminal instance of simony, which today is defined by Catholic sources as the sin of buying or selling church favors. In the Bible, Peter immediately rebukes and dismisses Simon. Thus, our prototype, heretic, and black magician began traveling with a Phoenician prostitute, gathering his own disciples who were impressed with his occult prowess. But would you believe that the story doesn't actually stop there? Even if its telling often does. For at some point, the enigmatic Simon Magus was reputed to have been taught by an even more secretive adept named Dositheos. Although Dositheos was reputed to have been a Samaritan, some legends speak of an Egyptian sojourn, where he and his disciple Simon allegedly acquired fantastic abilities such as invisibility, levitation, and shape-shifting into animal form. At least some of our modern knowledge about the obscure Dositheos, who was acquainted with John the Baptist and may have had connections to Essenism, comes by way of discoveries made in caves at Qumran, an archaeological site in the Palestinian-occupied territory known as the West Bank. The Wikipedia article on Dositheos quotes from the book The Dead Sea Scrolls and Primitive Christianity by the Jesuit modernist theologian and later Catholic cardinal John Dee. As a crypto-political aside, Danielu was discovered dead in 1974 under suspicious circumstances in the house of a known prostitute. But speaking of Dositheos and Simon Magus, the duo's impact was remarkable. Not only did Simonian Gnosticism persist for centuries, later writers such as 19th century French occultist Jules Doinel, 19th to 20th century British theosophist G.R.S. Mead, and even the great beast himself, British magician Aleister Crowley, would resurrect it for their own esoteric purposes. We got into greater detail on Crowley in Top 10 Occultists of All Time, 10 Sex Magic Cults, and 10 Occultists who were accused spies. Another hugely influential belief system with an ancient pedigree is Neoplatonism. We introduce this in 10 arcane words, most simply characterized as an expanded and mystified variety of the famous Greek philosopher Plato's theory of forms. Neoplatonism, as a contributor to the core of Western esotericism, has few rivals. One thinks only, for instance, of Hermeticism or Pythagoreanism, the latter being our focus in the video Pythagoras. Generally speaking, Neoplatonism represents a picture of a world in which true reality is hidden behind or above the mundane realm of appearances. In this way, the worldview underwrites practical magic, for consider that, on Neoplatonic assumptions, several of which are echoed in Eastern thought, every event in the visible world is the effect of an image, that is, of an idea in the unseen world. Everything that happens on Earth is only a reproduction, as it were, of an event in a world beyond our sense perception. Sages have access to these ideas and are able to intervene decisively in events in the world. We intend to expound on the history and philosophy of Neoplatonism in a future video, but for now, I'll just say that there are 4 names usually listed as being among the most visible ancient Neoplatonists in later esoteric literature. In reverse chronological order, these are the 5th century expositor Proclus, the 3rd to 4th century magician Iamblichus, the 3rd to 4th century codifier Porphyry, and the man usually regarded as the wellspring for the whole enterprise, the innovative 3rd century theorist Plotinus. However, Plotinus' speculations didn't arise in a vacuum. It turns out that he received instruction from a shadowy autodidact by the name of Ammonius Saccas. Vanishingly little is known about his personal views. Yet he is routinely cited for the profound impact he is alleged to have exerted upon Plotinus, and by extension, on the establishment of Neoplatonism. Ammonius was later claimed as a fellow traveler by adherents of both Christianity and paganism. This presents a puzzle and leads some scholars to suppose that there may have been 2 thinkers with the same name who were contemporaries. Of Ammonius's origins, no one can say for sure. He taught Plotinus in the important city of Alexandria, Egypt, which was then under the control of the Roman Empire. The city had a large Greek population, suggesting that Ammonius Saccas was ethnically Greek. But some analysts have observed that his given name, Ammonius, contains a Latinized reference to the Egyptian deity Amun, the primordial god of air. This raises the possibility that he may have been a Copt. Similar questions surround Plotinus' background. Stranger still, a few have proposed that Ammonius Saccas may actually have been of Indian extraction. If true, this would help to explain 2 curious pieces of data. Firstly, Ammonius Saccas had an affinity for Indian thought that he apparently transmitted to his pupil. According to the biographer and systematizer Porphyry, Plotinus' decade-long training by Ammonius Saccas primed him to make acquaintance with the Persian philosophical discipline and that prevailing among the Indians. Secondly, tenets of Neoplatonism are redolent of Vedanta, the dominant stream of philosophical Hinduism, which was derived from a collection of sacred texts called the Upanishads. A core notion of this viewpoint is often, albeit opaquely, articulated as the slogan, Atman is Brahman. This is to say that all individual souls, Atman, yours, mine, and everyone else's, are identical with the ultimate principle of reality, designated Brahman. There is a striking similarity between this doctrine and the crucial Neoplatonic notion that all reality is an emanation of and seeks to return to unity with the One. Stay tuned for further explorations of these abstractions. According to academic Arthur Verschluis, the traditions of Indian religion and Neoplatonism coalesced in the 19th century American Transcendentalist movement, famously associated with American writers Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. It's interesting to entertain the possibility that this represented a union of divergent strands that previously emerged from the same basic source. One of the most epoch-making textbooks on magic theory ever published was the 3-volume De Occulta Philosophia by the 15th to 16th century German Kabbalist and Neoplatonist Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. We showcased Agrippa twice already. First he appeared in our video Top 10 Occultists of All Time, and then again in 10 Occultists Who Were Accused Spies. Agrippa was born and received his early education in the German city of Köln, or Cologne, to native English speakers. This is significant because Cologne had been a stronghold of medieval scholasticism, a composite philosophical theological system expounding Christianity using the logical apparatus of Aristotle. Within that context, debate still broke out. At Cologne, the majority of the faculty followed the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas, known as Thomism, but a minority of schoolmen opted instead for Albertism, a competing system drawn from Aquinas' most distinguished teacher, Albert the Great, also known by the Latinized version of his name, Albertus Magnus. Although Albertism is little mentioned today, it was for a time preserved in Cologne, where Albert had spent time lecturing, by a coterie of scholars devoted to his outlook. A key point here is that Albert was regarded as having been sympathetic to and proficient in both alchemy and astrology. We touched upon the former in Top 10 Gold-Making Alchemists. As for the latter, in his Speculum Astronomiae, The Mirror of Astronomy, published circa 1260, Albertus Magnus had argued that astrological investigations were compatible with Christianity. Much later, Agrippa read his work and cited it as instrumental in his thinking. In the 14th century, Albertism was combined with Neoplatonism by the largely unknown Dominican Berthold of Meusburg. Thus, Agrippa would have been trained in what is now referred to as the Cologne tradition of Neoplatonism. Simultaneously, Agrippa mastered, and would also lecture on, humanist Catholic thinker Johann Reuchlin's seminal Kabbalistic treatise De Verbo Mirifico, printed in 1494. Incidentally, that title roughly translates to About the Miraculous Word, and is a sustained explication of the alleged magical power of the name Jesus. Reuchlin had been introduced to Jewish mysticism by the founder of so-called Christian Kabbalah, the Italian Renaissance innovator Pico della Mirandola, whom we will discuss further in a bit. It is difficult to understate Agrippa's significance. Occult philosophy was, in effect, the first attempt at a comprehensive encyclopedia of esotericism and magic. His thesis, that the Hermetic texts and the Kabbalistic writings were the gateway to true wisdom, and would restore the control of nature to humanity, who had lost it due to the sin of Adam. Early 20th century English historian Francis Yates relates the opinions of two specialists who believed that Agrippa and his associates formed some kind of secret society. For more on contemporary incarnations of such organizations, see 10 presidents who were members of secret societies. Incredibly, some historians of the origins of Protestantism in Geneva have regarded Agrippa and his circle as the seedbed of the Reformed faith. Of course, Reformed Christianity is merely another name for Calvinism, or the branch of Protestantism owing to 16th century French theologian John Calvin. Not only was Agrippa at ground zero for what developed into Calvinism, but he was also operating in humanist circles in England. This would have placed him in the orbit of the unfortunately named Oxford Reformers, provocative New Testament translator Erasmus, English statesman and Catholic martyr Sir Thomas More, and particularly Renaissance standard-bearer John Colet. And once again, behind Agrippa, the figure who was apparently so pivotal for preparing the ground for momentous religious changes on the continent and the British Isles, we find a more obscure intriguer lurking in the shadows. For before writing his magnum opus in 1509 to 1510, Agrippa was in Germany, visiting the learned Benedictine abbot Johannes Trithemius, supposedly born Johann Heidenberg, to whom De Occulta Philosophia would be dedicated. 19th century French occultist Eliphas Levi, born Alphonse Louis Constant, on whom see Top 10 Occultists of all time, praised Trithemius as having been the most accomplished magician of his era. Besides Agrippa, Trithemius had at least one other illustrious student. The revolutionary alchemist and medical reformer Paracelsus, born Theophrastus von Hohenheim, regarded as the Martin Luther of the physicians, identified the famous Kabbalist Johannes Trithemius as among his tutors. Additionally, Dr. John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's royal astrologer, whom we also ranked one of the occult practitioners with the most enduring legacies, and who at the time had one of the world's most extensive libraries, was acquainted with several of Trithemius's books. This included Trithemius's The Steganographia, written in 1500, which contained many numerological and astrological calculations connected with angels, as well as instructions on how to summon them, to gain knowledge, and how to send messages over long distances by means of angelic agency. Because of these alleged angelological dealings, Trithemius garnered a reputation as a demonic magician, necromancer, and and sorcerer. Like the mysterious abbot himself, Dee developed a reputation as a dark conjurer. Both the Steganographia and Trithemius's follow-up volume, titled the Polygraphiae, are regarded as seminal texts in the field of cryptography. We touched on these cipher texts and the possibility that John Dee may have exploited Trithemian ciphers to send coded messages for the English crown in 10 occultists who were accused spies. On a darker wavelength was Trithemius's De Septem Secundae, about the 7 secondary causes, a treatise on astrology and Kabbalistic magic that, among other influences, seems to have confirmed John Dee on a path that would result in the creation of so-called Enochian magic. Confidence in his monumental importance for later streams of occultism is inversely proportional to relative uncertainty about the details of his early life and intellectual formation. In various biographical snippets readily available online, one finds unfailingly repeated a fairy tale-like anecdote about Trithemius's unlikely and inexplicably swift ascent. A 20-year-old Trithemius was supposedly returning home from university when he was caught in a snowstorm. The ferocity of the storm was such that he sought refuge in a Benedictine abbey. The story goes that he decided to stay there, and within a year he was made abbot or head monk. Trithemius himself claimed that he had been schooled in various esoteric arts by one Libanius Gallus, an otherwise unknown adept. But the autobiographical questions ramify when we learn that Libanius Gallus was said again by the precocious abbot himself to merely have been an intermediary between Trithemius and an even more secretive mage, allegedly named Pelagius of Majorca after Majorca, the Spanish island that is one of the top 10 largest in the Mediterranean Sea. Stay tuned for more on these sorts of crypto-politically magnetic areas. Some historians, such as Paolo Zambelli, have concluded that both Pelagius and Libanius were fictions invented by our abbot. Another possibility is that they are veiled acknowledgments of real people. One thinks, for instance, of the 13th century proto-Kabbalist Raymond Lull, who happened to be from Majorca. Still, as Michael Hoffman remarks, due to Trithemius's preposterous account of his own rise and influence, we must assume that the abbot was assisted by a person or persons unknown. Along a similar line, writer Rosemary Gilly states that, early in his own intellectual formation, Trithemius went to Heidelberg, a center of alchemy and occultism, where he became the student of an unknown teacher. Speaking of Kabbalists, the short-lived Renaissance syncretist Giovanni Pico della Mirandola exercised an outsized influence on subsequent esotericism, especially in its Neoplatonic incarnations. His main contributions were twofold. Firstly, particularly via his captivating oration on the dignity of man, Pico gave expression to his magical view of man as master of the created world. Later interpreters understood Pico to have been asserting that man is set apart from the rest of creation and is completely free to form his own nature. In 1486, Pico went to Rome, ostensibly to contend with Vatican theologians over some 900 theses of his that he claimed showed errors in Catholic theology and in the philosophical system of churchmen, such as St. Thomas Aquinas. No fewer than 72 of Pico's conclusions were culled from Kabbalistic sources, and 13 of the 900 were condemned as heretical. Eventually, Pico was forced to flee Rome, but was given refuge in Florence by Lorenzo de' Medici. Pico's thought, as articulated in these documents and his subsequent work, arguably became a major component of later philosophies such as those of Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, which place an emphasis upon will. But it also formed the part of the foundation for various occult currents, such as those involving figures like Eliphas Levi, according to whom the pentagram symbolized the sovereignty of the will, and Aleister Crowley, whose quasi-religion of Thelema is also concerned with human willpower. We surveyed both Levi and Crowley and top 10 occultists. Secondly, Pico is credited with introducing the Jewish mystical Kabbalah into Western occultism. This would have a monumental impact. In the first place, it created right away the curious amalgam known as Christian Kabbalah. Of course, predictably, it seems that Pico wasn't acting on his own hook. Standing behind him were several figures about whom little else is known, beyond their tutelage of the young Italian. One of them was the noteworthy Jewish Averroist Elijah Del Medigo. Among other effects, Del Medigo seemed to have primed Pico for his interest in an Aristotelianism that was separate from the usual Catholic framework set in place by the great Dominican theologian St. Thomas Aquinas. Another was Rabbi Yohanan Alamano, from whom Pico learned the rudiments of Hebrew, Alemanno was also known for his view that natural magic was inferior to the Kabbalah, which provides the keys to a divine magic. But it was from one Samuel ben Nassim Bolfarag, alias Guglielmo Raimondo de Moncada, alias Flavius Mithridates, Pico's tutor in Aramaic, that Pico would learn the most about Kabbalistic secrets. British Renaissance historian Francis Yates reports that chief among the Spanish Jews who instructed Pico was the mysterious character known as Flavius Mithridates, who provided Pico with Kabbalist manuscripts. In the words of UCLA professor Brian Copenhaver, Flavius Mithridates was Pico's most prolific Jewish informant, who translated and mistranslated thousands of pages of Kabbalah into Latin for him. Copenhaver's aside raises questions about Flavius's honesty. A commentator of unknown reliability introduces a record of one of Flavius's speeches, delivered on Good Friday in front of the Pope no less, by saying that, although he dazzled the clerics with his linguistic abilities, he fabricated evidence in the manner of a clever charlatan. As an added layer of intrigue, and not unlike so many of the mysterious individuals on this list, not unlike Pico in fact, Flavius Mithridates enjoyed the protection of highly placed and powerful people. The Encyclopedia Judaica observes that in Rome, Flavius had once been under the patronage of Giovanni Battista Cibo, Bishop of Molfetta, who later became Pope Innocent VIII. Yates draws attention to the high strangeness of the relationship between Pico and Flavius, stating that the latter encouraged Pico in the Christian interpretation of Kabbalah, even to the point of inserting into the text interpolations of his own pointing in a Christian direction. Yates candidly confesses her own astonishment, asking what can have been Flavius's motive in thus encouraging and directing Pico towards his momentous adoption of Kabbalah into Christianity. Similar weirdness also surrounds the earlier 14th to 15th century Constantinopolitan scholar Gemistus Pletho. He was a well-connected Byzantine Greek who rejected Eastern Orthodoxy and advocated a return to paganism, ostensibly combined with a Neoplatonic form of Christianity. Pletho, sometimes alternatively called Plethon, was a major catalyst for Italian Renaissance interest in Plato. First of all, he was a celebrated participant in the Council of Ferrara, Florence, held over an almost 20-year period from 1431 to 1449. The council was called to try to undo the Great Schism of 1054. Also called the East-West Schism, you'll recall that this separated Christianity into Eastern Orthodoxy on one hand and Roman Catholicism on another. Secondly, Pletho gave numerous well-attended lectures on the difference between Aristotle and Plato, some of which were apparently heard by Florentine banker Cosimo de' Medici. De' Medici proceeded to establish a Platonic academy in Florence. Subsequently, he funded the research and translation projects of Italian priest-scholar Marsilio Ficino. Ficino, along with the previously mentioned Pico della Mirandola, would basically open wide the doors for mysticism, magic, and revive Neoplatonism in the Catholic Church. In fact, Pletho arguably paved the way for Pico. And wouldn't you know it, according to Pletho's dogged ideological adversary, Georgios Scalarius, a man who would later become Patriarch of Constantinople under the name Gennadios II, some of Pletho's ideas had been suggested to him by a Kabbalist named Eliphas. Of course, the allegations, while provocative, are far from historically certain. Nevertheless, if true, they would mean that two major esoterically oriented streams, Kabbalism and Neoplatonism, were introduced into Western Christianity partially under rabbinic superintendence. Fast-forwarding to the Enlightenment, Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, allegedly born with the more modest name Giuseppe Balsamo, was an 18th century Sicilian Jewish adventurer, healer, hermeticist, and mesmerist. We covered Cagliostro, who was recently incorporated into the Doctor Strange storyline in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in our video titled Top 10 Occultists of All Time, where we noted his alleged involvement in a notorious French political scandal. Known as the Affair of the Diamond Necklace, it was made into a film in 2001 featuring actress Hilary Swank, actor Jonathan Pryce, and Christopher Walken as Cagliostro. The Count is also remembered for his institution of a so-called Egyptian variety of Freemasonry with Kabbalistic, sorcerous overtones. Cagliostro's rite admitted women and also established the foundation for what would later develop into the ancient and primitive rite of Memphis Misraim. Some accounts suggest that Cagliostro, who was allegedly trained in sex magic by an adept whose identity will be disclosed in a few minutes, forced his wife to sell sexual favors in order to augment his income. According to his critics, he was a swindler who gallivanted about Europe engaging in confidence scams and evading his creditors. That is, until he ran afoul of the Roman Inquisition, allegedly trying to found a lodge of the Brotherhood right in the Vatican's backyard, and for his efforts was imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Viewers of Ron Howard's 2006 film Angels and Demons, Dan Brown's sequel to the wildly successful The Da Vinci Code, will recognize the imposing cylindrical mausoleum from an exciting scene as the movie builds towards its climax. In any case, some say that Cagliostro was eventually moved to the fortress of San Leo, where he died in 1795. No prison could hold a man so supernaturally empowered as Cagliostro, or, some say, legend holds that arcane symbols covered the walls of his cell. Subsequently, rumors of his magical escape and subsequent reappearances gained currency in esoteric circles. Bear in mind that he is said to have impressed a string of monarchs and other powerful people, including Russian Empress Catherine the Great and the French-born German Cardinal Prince de Rohan. He was by no means a raving lunatic. So began tales suggesting that Cagliostro possessed coveted secrets for the attainment of limitless wealth and miraculously long life, if not immortality. For more information on these fabled goals of alchemy, see Top 10 Gold-Making Alchemists. From where, or from whom, had he acquired his arcane knowledge? According to one persistent account, young Giuseppe Balsamo had served as famulus to a mysterious adept named Altotas. According to Freemasonic writer Manly Palmer Hall, Altotas was well versed in several branches of philosophy and science, and also a master of the transcendental arts. Famous British occultist Arthur Edward Waite, whose name is preserved in his still widely used Rider-Waite tarot deck, tells us that Altotas was a magician and doctor, which in combination of course imply that he was an alchemist. For more on which, see our list of all-time top 10 alleged gold makers. Some rumors suggested that Altotas was Greek, or had he been an Arab. A.E. Waite reported that Altotas had been Cagliostro's tutor in Medina, in what is now Saudi Arabia. He repeats an account to the effect that Altotas was in possession of several Arabic manuscripts and assumed great skill in chemistry. Waite quotes from one account of Cagliostro reporting that both student and teacher wore the dress of Muslims and outwardly professed the Mohammedan law. 19th century French novelist and playwright Alexandre Dumas père picked up on this thread and wove it into the first volume of his 8-book series on ill-fated French queen Marie Antoinette. In that work, Dumas alludes to Altotas' knowledge of angelology. Of course, the tale assumes that Cagliostro himself had ever been to the Near East. Regardless, however, the description invokes the specter of our contemporary Shriners, or the ancient Arabic order of the Nobles of the Mystic Shrine, a so-called appendant body of master Freemasons, who also drape themselves in the trappings of Islam. For further information, see our video 10 Presidents Who Belong to Secret Societies. Elsewhere, Altotas is called an Armenian. Plainly, versions of the story differ considerably. Possibly, the future Count Cagliostro had met Altotas in Messina, Sicily, and apprenticed with him there. In any event, and if Altotas even existed at all, the pair is said to have ended up on the island of Malta. Malta, of course, was the headquarters for one of the Catholic Church's oldest military religious orders. Originally founded as the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, otherwise known as the Hospitallers, a string of defeats prompted their periodic relocation. First they ended up on the island of Cyprus, then Rhodes, and finally Malta. Supposedly, Altotas was so connected that he was able to effect Cagliostro's introduction to the Grand Master of that august organization, into which our mysterious Count claimed to have been initiated. What happened to Altotas after this, no one seems to have discovered. As Waite writes, the mysterious personage vanished like a meteor. Altotas simply receded into the background while his pupil proceeded to revolutionize the ritualism of Masonry. Unless, well, hold that thought. Cagliostro is perhaps the best known of a number of 18th century adventurers who were able, at least for a short time, to capitalize on the venality of European nobles. Among this group also were the famed Italian Lothario Casanova, and the charismatic and curious wonder man known as the Comte de Saint-Germain. By his own account, Saint-Germain, deriving from the phrase Sanctus Germanus, meaning holy brother, was an assumed name. Saint-Germain was so successful in keeping everything pertaining to his early life completely hidden that even his original name is still unknown. That hasn't dissuaded sundry investigators from trying to ferret out his name. In a sort of real-life approximation of the fairy tale of the gold-spinning imp Rumpelstiltskin, with Samuel Sommer, Daniel Wolfe, and Simon Wolfe, or variations thereof, cropping up as prominent guesses. But who he really was, or where he came from, probably will never be known, for he was a master of disguise and impersonation. Saint-Germain's pedigree is as debated as other aspects of his life. At various times, and by diverse observers, he had been labeled a Hungarian prince, or the fabled wandering Jew, and quite a few things in between, including Transylvanian royalty. This latter possibility, if true, might have made Saint-Germain a forebear of Britain's current King Charles III, who you may recall previously claimed bloodthirsty Romanian ruler Vlad the Impaler as a relation. Vlad, of course, was part of the inspiration for the vampiric Count Dracula. The year of his birth is unclear, and given that he never seemed to grow any older, some contemporaries were convinced that he was, as he claimed, hundreds of years old. The arch-skeptic Voltaire sarcastically referred to Saint-Germain as a man who never dies and who knows everything. As mentioned in 10 Occultist Spies, in 1778, Voltaire had been initiated into French Freemasonry by none other than American founding father Benjamin Franklin. Voltaire's co-sponsor had been Coeur de Jabulon, who, according to Manly Hall, was instructed in Masonic philosophy by Cagliostro. A preposterous array of past lives have been assigned to Saint-Germain, whether by popular acclaim or by retelling of his own autobiographical declarations. These include the 13th century proto-scientist Roger Bacon and the 16th to 17th century English essayist and statesman Sir Francis Bacon, both of whom we have mentioned before. It was fabled about him that he had known personally Saint Anne, the grandmother of Jesus, and that he was instrumental in having the Council of Nicaea approve her canonization. He knew Jesus too, and intervened with Judean governor Pontius Pilate in his favor. To many observers it was clear that he was in possession of the fabulous elixir of life, the ultimate quest of all alchemists. In fact, some say that Saint-Germain recorded his coveted procedures, encrypted of course, in the codex known as the Triangular Manuscript, not least because he seemed to live and travel without visible means of financial support. Famous and elusive Saint-Germain convinced many European aristocrats he could create gold. One testimony comes from Casanova. In his memoirs, Casanova reported seeing dramatic evidence of Saint-Germain's wizardry. It seems that Casanova paid a visit to the Comte and asked him about his alleged alchemical transmuting agent. Saint-Germain produced a vial, which he called the universal spirit of nature. Casanova stated that the mysterious white liquid magically evaporated when he attempted to open the container to inspect its contents. On these proto-chemical angles, see 10 gold-making alchemists. Saint-Germain was also a reputed clairvoyant, Rosicrucian mind reader, and telepath. In his usual oracular style, Manly Hall claims that Saint-Germain assisted pioneering hypnotherapist Franz Anton Mesmer, even claiming that mesmerism was the brainchild of the Comte. On the other hand, Nesta Webster takes exactly the opposite approach, writing that the famous Swabian Dr. Mesmer is in a superior category to Saint-Germain and Cagliostro. Like Cagliostro, Saint-Germain maintained numerous connections to Freemasonry, and the indefatigable Manly Hall tells us that the Comte de Saint-Germain was both a Mason and a Templar. In fact, Saint-Germain is often said to have initiated Cagliostro into some form of Masonic Illuminism. Illuminism is a somewhat opaque synonym for enlightenment. During the heyday of the intellectual movement by that name, which occurred roughly in late 17th and 18th centuries, there was an exaltation of the powers of the human mind. This illumination could take the form of a Gnostic-like awakening, precipitated by contact with some tantalizing bits of hidden knowledge, as we have covered in our several videos on Gnosticism. Or, Illuminism could depend instead on an exaggerated confidence in human brain power and ingenuity. This rationalism, in a broad sense, was typical philosophers of the period, regardless of whether they favored a priori argumentation, which was pioneered by René Descartes and carried on by such thinkers as Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, or whether they leaned more heavily on a posteriori, empirical methodology, as did John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. The difficulty with a figure like the Comte is situating him along this continuum. In the words of Antoine Fevre, men like Saint-Germain were expert in exploiting the taste for the marvelous, consensus that prevailed in their age. On this consensus ivory tower view, Saint-Germain was an expert, or at least an intuitive psychologist of human nature, who used early developments in science to dazzle the mob and pretend spiritual enlightenment. Still, he was indisputably a true Renaissance man in the colloquial sense. Allegedly, he was a linguistic savant. 20th century Hungarian Jewish Orientalist Raphael Patai tells us that Saint-Germain was reputed to have spoken Spanish and Portuguese to perfection, Italian admirably, and German and English very well. French with a slight Piedmontese accent, the Eastern European Jewish dialect Yiddish, and a smattering of Hindustani. So important was Saint-Germain for the subsequent development of esotericism that were we previously to have cataloged the top 11 occultists instead of 10, he would have contended for the extra spot. Similarly, given rumors that he was under the protection of the last Medicis, or an agent in the service of Prussian ruler Frederick the Great, we could have featured him in occultists who were accused spies. Another puzzle pertains to the identity of Saint-Germain's teacher. If you can believe it, that name is even harder to ascertain with any confidence. Nesta Webster traces Saint-Germain's instruction back to one Schröpfer, who declared that no one could be a true Freemason without practicing magic. These mysteries, combined with an innate charm and an eclectic array of interests, made the Comte de Saint-Germain a favorite dinner guest in many royal households, at least at first. He seems to have run into legal troubles in England, France, and the Netherlands, but eventually he decamped for Germany, where he lived out his days in apparent comfort, if not luxury, under the protection of a wealthy patron. Upon Saint-Germain's death around 1784-1785, a royal benefactor destroyed his papers, justifying the decision by saying that he didn't want them to be misconstrued by the ignorant. Perhaps more than his contemporaries, Saint-Germain seemed to become larger than life in the years following his alleged death. I say alleged death since stories of sightings of the miracle worker pile up in a manner similar to those about Elvis Presley. A year after his reported demise, Saint-Germain was supposedly elected by Masons, including the groundbreaking hypnotist Franz Anton Mesmer, to represent their order at an upcoming convention. Subsequently, he was also supposedly seen retiring to Tibet, which seems to have given rise to, or at least encouraged, the belief that Saint-Germain had joined the ranks of an exalted class of mystics, variously designated Ascended Masters, or Mahatmas. Indeed, Helena P. Blavatsky, whom we covered in Top 10 Occultists, principal founder in 1875 of the Theosophical Society, which we discussed in 10 Arcane Words, references Saint-Germain along with other supposed masters, Moria and Kutumi, as collectively directing Earth's affairs behind the scenes as the Great White Brotherhood. Madame Blavatsky's intellectual and spiritual heirs, including Annie Besant and Charles Webster Leadbetter, claim to have had dealings with the Count. Saint-Germain's influence extends even further. Several key New Agers profess the Comte's involvement in their enterprises. For instance, Guy and Edna Ballard established the I Am movement under the auspices of the Saint-Germain Foundation. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, matron of the Church Universal and Triumphant, articulated a complicated lore surrounding Saint-Germain, including the belief that he somehow inspired the Constitution of the United States. Throughout her tenure as Guru Ma, Prophet claimed continual or periodic contact with various ascended masters, especially Saint-Germain. These tales have cemented Saint-Germain's legacy as one of the most powerful and proficient adepts of all time. In fact, Manly Palmer Hall says that Sir Francis Bacon and the Comte de Saint-Germain were the two great emissaries sent into the world by the secret brotherhood. For what purpose, we're left to guess. Let me momentarily interrupt the Cagliostro saga with all the various behind-the-scenes operators, for there is one aspect of it that is probably best introduced by way of example. For the illustration, we'll turn to a man who, for all intents and purposes, kick-started the so-called occult revival in the 19th century, which we highlighted in the video 10 Arcane Words. Born Alphonse Louis Constant, he is far better known under his assumed and Hebraicized name Eliphas Levi. Of course, Levi was a major name in top 10 occultists of all time. His chief contribution to occultism was his suggestion that there were esoteric correspondences between the 22 paths of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life and the 22 major trumps in the tarot pack of cards. Levi synthesized a transcendental magic out of material gleaned from a wide variety of sources. These included idiosyncratic 16th to 17th century German mystic Jakob Boehme, 17th to 18th century Swedish theosopher Emanuel Swedenborg, 18th century Freemason and tarot enthusiast Antoine Coeur de Javelin, 18th to 19th century German animal magnetism theorist and hypnotist Franz Anton Mesmer, 18th to 19th century French poet Antoine Fabre d'Olivet, and 18th to 19th century French esoteric Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, founder of Martinism. These were centered around the Jewish mystical Kabbalah, which we have repeatedly encountered. What was additionally unique about Levi, however, was that he seems to have fused two Kabbalistic streams together. On the one hand, Levi was acquainted with Christian Kabbalah, as it had originated with Pico and filtered down to the 17th century German Hebraist Christian Nor von Rosenroth. In 1684, Rosenroth had published the influential compendium Kabbalah Denudata, or Kabbalah Uncovered. On the other hand, there were several separate strands of Kabbalah originating in Poland. One of these owed to Jakob Frank, a follower of the curious 17th century messianic pretender Sabbatai Zevi. We touched on both Zevi and Frank in 10 sex magic cults. Another Polish current came from Hasidism. Fittingly for the present topic, its history is complex and obscure, but it seems to have been introduced into Poland from Prague during the latter's so-called Golden Age in the 17th century. At that time, the community presumably was in custody of the teachings of the 16th century Rabbi Judah Loew, known as the Maharal of Prague. He is still remembered for his supposed magical creation of a Frankenstein-like monster called a golem. Again, for more, see 10 sex magic cults. From the Bohemian capital of Prague, Kabbalistic teachings passed to a line of practitioners known as Baal Shem. Literally signifying Lord of the Name, the specific reference is to the Tetragrammaton, or the 4 letters making up the name Yahweh, which is regarded as the ultimate magical formula. Various Baal Shem are reputed to be adept at such things as manufacturing magical amulets and talismans, casting and averting the evil eye, summoning and controlling demons, and so on. In any case, the Hasidic movement was founded in 18th century Poland by one Israel ben Eliezer, better known as the Baal Shem Tov. In the words of the late historian James Webb, the Baal Shem Tov fashioned Hasidism into a mass movement by placing emphasis on an interpretation of the popular elements in the Kabbalah. As a consequence, the often abstruse doctrines of the Jewish mystical philosophers were rendered more intelligible to Gentiles. Judeo-Christian sects sprang up throughout Poland and Russia, with rituals based on these esoteric doctrines. Our Magus, Eliphas Levi, was initiated into this form of Kabbalism by the 18th to 19th century Polish-born French emigre Josef Maria Hoena Wronski. Among other things, Wronski was a mathematician. He therefore brought a dose of Neo-Pythagoreanism into his metaphysical speculations, which he also communicated to Levi. Similarly to his star pupil, Levi, Wronski himself was well versed in Kabbalah, Boehme, and Gnosticism. No word on what would have become of Alphonse Louis Constant without his fateful encounter with his obscure Polish master. But it may well be that just as it was Levi's work which formed the narrow channel through which the whole Western tradition of magic flowed to the modern era, it was Wronski's work through which important aspects of that tradition were communicated to Levi. With those later historical developments in place, let's return to Cagliostro. You see, among the mysterious count's teachers was yet another rabbinical Baal Shem. In this case, we're referring to Rabbi Chaim Samuel Jacob Falk, otherwise called the Baal Shem of London. Apparently, Londoners referred to him as Dr. Falcon, which creates a curious sync with the reclusive computer genius by a similarly pronounced name from the 1983 movie War Games. Falk claimed descent from King David. Rabbi Falk emerged out of Shabbatayanism, that is a modified messianic form of Judaism. Shabbatayanism sought to preserve a legacy of Sabbatai Zevi, whom we mentioned in passing moments ago, and whom we sketched in Top 10 Sex Magic Cults. Like several entrants on this list, Falk became known early as a magician, and like Cagliostro and Saint-Germain specifically, Falk had numerous run-ins with civil authorities. Apparently, he was almost executed in Germany for practicing sorcery and witchcraft. In one dark episode, for example, example, Falk supposedly sacrificed a black calf in the presence of several noblemen, one of whom saw his valet suffer a fatal injury to his spine. According to the report, the unnamed young man had his neck so twisted that, had he lived after the accident that in fact took his life, he could have only seen backward. Falk decamped for England, where initially he was on the outs with the Jewish community in London, perhaps because he was laboring under suspicion of fraud and heresy, accusations that had been thrown at him by influential German Talmudist Jakob Emden, who had ties to the city. However, again as with Cagliostro and Saint-Germain, as well as with numerous other occultists such as Jakob Frank, Falk managed to secure financial assistance from a wealthy family. When he died, Falk was in relatively affluent circumstances. Falk's relationship with the broader community improved when he reportedly saved the Great Synagogue from destruction by fire by means of magical inscription. Falk's relationship with the broader community improved when he reportedly saved the Great Synagogue from destruction by fire by means of a magical inscription, presumably a representation of the Tetragrammaton, which he applied to the doorposts. Dr. Falcon supposedly had an unnatural-seeming silver candelabrum that illuminated his study without visible use of conventional oil or wax. And like Saint-Germain, it was said of him that he could subsist for long periods of time without eating or drinking. By feats such as these, he achieved notoriety in both Jewish and non-Jewish circles for his Kabbalistic practices based on the use of the mysterious name of God, hence becoming known as a Baal Shem, Master of the Divine Name. Among other things, Falk was believed to be able to effect curses by manufacturing and using Kabbalistic talismans. By wielding a magic wand constructed from a rolled-up scroll, the Baal Shem of London seemed to exert control over angelic spirits. According to the esteemed British Jewish historian Cecil Roth, Rabbi Falk maintained some sort of Kabbalistic laboratory on the symbolically charged London Bridge, and he was also believed to be seeking the Philosopher's Stone with great zeal. Nesta Webster supposed that, from his London-based headquarters, Dr. Falcon may have been one of the concealed or unknown superiors who stood behind numerous individuals and movements. Included in these categories would be Baron Karl Gotthold von Hund and his rite of strict observance, which lurks in the prehistory of the now superseding Scottish Rite. In any case, Falk certainly was in contact with Cagliostro. According to Cagliostro's own account, his Egyptian Masonic rite was derived from a manuscript by a certain George Cofton, whose real identity has never been discovered, which he bought by chance in London. According to the late 19th to early 20th century English Freemasonic degree connoisseur John Yarker, the rite of Cagliostro was clearly that of Martinus de Pascali. Pascali, whom we mentioned in 10 Arcane Words, founded a Masonic rite in 1754. Its seventh degree was that of Rose Croix. The ceremonies were of a theurgic or magical nature. Communications were supposed to be had with the spiritual world. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Webster herself is inclined to the opinion that Cagliostro and Pascali both derived their systems from an eminent Jewish Kabbalist in London, that is, Falk. It may have been Saint-Germain who personally initiated Cagliostro into the Lodge of Illuminists at his castle in Holstein, but it was the Rabbi Jakob Falk who taught him sex magic. As a final note, consider the mysterious document known as the Most Holy Trinus Sophia, or the Most Holy Threefold Wisdom. Variously reputed to have been written by Cagliostro or Saint-Germain, it combines alchemical and Masonic symbolism with the Kabbalah. Given this, perhaps the viewer will forgive us for speculating that the volume owes its content, if not its construction, to Dr. Falcon. Perhaps no word provokes as many strong reactions, whether out of curiosity, derision, or enthusiasm, as Illuminati and its cognates. The term has so many colloquial and technical variations that it would be best if I saved its exploration for a dedicated study. Still, I can't help but to introduce it here on account of its relevance for this particular investigation. Often imagined representing the upper echelon of an all-encompassing global economic and socio-political control apparatus, it was established in Bavaria, in what is now Germany, as a bona fide quasi-Masonic organization. It was founded in 1776, no less, which you'll probably agree was a pretty important year as far as world historic events go. The key player was a 20-something-year-old law professor named Adam Weishaupt. The story of the Illuminati is extraordinarily tangled, and it is frequently difficult difficult to separate fact from fiction. The official record, if there is such a thing, associates the group with some minor characters such as the German writer Adolf Knigge. Its goals were said to be furtherance of the sort of anti-clerical and anti-monarchical program that one would expect from an Enlightenment-era movement. And according to the surface-level narrative, the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati was outlawed along with other secret societies, and disbanded sometime between 1784 and 1787. On the question of whether this decree from officialdom ended the story of the Illuminati or not, there is no shortage of dissenting opinions. Convinced anti-Masons can be relied upon to discover Illuminati influence persisting in various dark corners of crypto-politics and in the realm of secret societies, on which see our list of top 10 presidents who reveled in such associations. By the same token, one can expect Freemasons and their apologists almost reflexively to deny any continuation, not to mention dominion, of the Bavarian Illuminati. Given this, however, one may puzzle over certain sentiments expressed by Trevor McKeon, longtime head librarian at the Masonic Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon. According to McKeon, from Weishaupt's inception of the order in 1776 until today, the world has indeed conformed to the Illuminati blueprint. McKeon summarizes by exclaiming, "You could say that the Illuminati won." How a long-defunct organization managed the trick of realizing its world vision is anybody's guess. But more interesting for us at present is the observation that the Order of the Illuminati has been linked with individuals with far more prominence than Adolf Knigge. One thinks, for example, of the 18th to 19th century German animal magnetism theorist Franz Anton Mesmer, and the previously named Count Cagliostro. That, and of course, the claimed influence of yet another mystery man. Nesta Webster wrote of him, "Colmer remains the most mysterious of all the mystery men of his day." According to her research, Colmer spent many years in Egypt and then combed Europe in search of converts to a secret doctrine founded on Manichaeanism that he had learned from the East. For more on the doctrines owing to the Persian prophet Mani, the particulars of whose life, per Freemasonic writer Manly Palmer Hall, was one of the origins of the Masonic phrase, the widow's son. See Top 10 Sex Magic Cults. To read Webster's account, following Colmer's movements is like completing a connect the dots exercise using many of Europe's key synchromystical nodes. First, he stopped at Malta, where he met Cagliostro and nearly brought about an insurrection amongst the people. Colmer was therefore driven out of the island by the Knights of Malta, and repaired to Avignon and Lyon. Here he made a few disciples amongst the Illuminates, and in the same year went on to Germany, where he encountered Weishaupt and initiated him into all the mysteries of his secret doctrine. Quite a journey. That such a man may have been behind Weishaupt is extraordinary, for consider that Weishaupt has been linked both to the Jesuits and to the Rothschild banking powerhouse. Such complexities cry out for more scrutiny. Therefore, we intend to probe these and other topics more fully in upcoming videos, so stay tuned for 10 precursors to the Bavarian Illuminati.